Let's talk about the secret to money and happiness. If you just had to guess, what's the general relationship between money and happiness?
Positive.
Yeah, it's positive, and people would assume that it's more or less a straight line. They would think it looks something like this. Does that make sense? That's what people think. Now, do you think that's actually true? No. It turns out there is a point where extra money does, and I won't even say it increases your happiness. What it does is alleviates pain. And so just like avoiding a cost means more money in your pocket, avoiding pain means more happiness. And so right up to this point where I have basically met all my needs, then money and happiness go together. But then when we get up here, something interesting starts to happen. It starts to kind of trail off and become somewhat asymptotic. Meaning that there's this maximum level of happiness that you're going to have regardless of how much money you have. I have reached a point in my life to where all of my remaining problems cannot be solved by money. Does that make sense? Every problem, and I got problems, right? But they can't be solved with money. And so basically, it doesn't matter how much more money I got, my happiness isn't going to increase all that much. This is because of the declining marginal utility of consumption. The marginal utility of $1 is always positive, but the more money you've got, the less each additional dollar does for you. And we refer to this whole thing as the hedonic treadmill. And the best illustration of this hedonic treadmill is when you ask people, how much money would it take to make you happy? It doesn't matter whether they're poor, middle class, or rich. The answer is always something in the neighborhood of 20%. So you think, oh, well, if I just had 20% more, I'd be happy. So then you end up getting 20% more. Do you think you're happy? No. What do you say then? 20% more. So it's always 20% more. So what does this mean? From a perspective of can money make you totally happy, the answer is no, because you're always going to want 20% more. That's the hedonic treadmill. So what does that mean to you as a person? Don't assume that money can make you happy. You have to have other things in your life. Having enough money is one part of being happy. Then there are these other things. They usually have to do with relationships and things like that. Questions? Okay. So last time we were talking about the operating period at the firm, the operating cycle. And we said basically if you add the days in inventory to the days in accounts receivable, that gives you the operating cycle. And then we said if you wanted to find out the cash cycle, you're going to have to subtract the AP period. What does AP stand for? Accounts payable, right? And so this is really one that you may not have calculated all that much in your previous finance classes, but we start out by, of course, figuring the turns. And the turns here are in terms of cost of goods sold divided by your average accounts payable. If I just give you an AP, one number, you use that. If I give you beginning and ending, you add those together and divide by 2 and use that number. Now remember, when we did inventory turns, we used cost of goods sold. When we did accounts receivables turns, what did we use? That's that top, the numerator.
Sales.
Yeah, sales, thank you. This time we're using cost of goods sold. Can anyone explain to me why I would use cost of goods sold here on my accounts payables turns?
It's apples to apples.
Yeah, it's the apples to apples thing. So I'm going to chuck you a coin. Are you ready? Sweet. Okay. It's apples to apples, right? Because if we have bought something, that is going to be recorded in accounts payable at the cost to us. It's also going to be recorded in our cost of goods sold that way, and it's going to be recorded in our inventory. So that's why those are all in terms of cost of goods sold. So we've got payable or cost of goods sold here of 8,200 and payables of 875. So that's 9.37 turns. So how do I turn turns into days? I just take 365 and divide by those turns, and it gives me 39 days in payables. So now we have the operating cycle, which we calculated last time. We have the accounts payable period. We can go ahead and subtract that accounts payable period from the operating cycle, and it gives us the cash cycle, and the cash cycle is 129.4 days. So what's our interpretation of that? It's 129.4 days on average from the time that we actually pay for the inventory until we receive cash for that inventory. So it's the cash to cash thing. So that's why we refer to this as the cash cycle. Any questions? So what do you think would be better, a higher cash cycle or a lower cash cycle? You guys like having cash out there waiting for it to come in? No, I don't either. And so we would like this cash cycle to be as short as possible. And remember last time I told you it's possible for it to even be negative. Look at Amazon. Undoubtedly they have negative cash cycle on at least some of their stuff. So how do we shorten the cash cycle? Well, remember that it's the inventory period plus the accounts receivable period minus the accounts payable period. So that means we either need to reduce the inventory period, which means increasing our inventory turns. We need to reduce the receivables period, which means increasing our accounts receivable turns, or we need to increase our payables period, which means to reduce the AP turns. Now let's walk through each one of these things. Inventory turns is cost of goods sold divided by inventory. How would I increase my inventory turns? There are two possible ways. Oh, come on, it's just a fraction. What are the two ways I can make this bigger? Mr. Barbosh.
Increase the,
Oh my Lord. You guys are about to graduate from here, and you can't mess with even basic fractions? Mr. Huang, if you're going to make this fraction greater, you can increase one thing and decrease one thing. What's the one thing that we should try to think about increasing to make this fraction bigger? What's that? Mr. Rollins, help us out.
Increase the numerator or decrease the denominator.
Yeah, this is so simple, guys. I could either increase this, decrease this, or do both. That's just math. Now, let's ask the question, how would we go about doing that? Now, sometimes I've had students in the past that say, well, let's just increase how much we're paying for the stuff that we're buying. Does that sound like a smart thing to do? No, that's stupid. And by the way, that would also increase your inventory because your inventory is recorded at cost. So that's not the answer. Remember, this thing stands in for sales. The only reason we're using cost of goods sold instead of sales is for that apples to apples comparison. And so your choices here are either to increase your sales or decrease your inventory. Which one of those do you think is easier to do? Yeah, decreasing the inventory is a whole lot easier than increasing sales. So I told you guys I used to be a salesman, right? That's the last real job that I had before I became this, what you see now. Okay, so I was a salesperson, and then I had moved on to doctoral school, and my sister moved into sales. And this is the first Thanksgiving after my sister has moved into sales, and we're all at the family table, and my sister had just made her first visit of her clients. And my mom says, "Did you sell anything?" And we both laughed. My sister and I both laughed. And I said, "Mom, selling is not hunting, it's gardening." Do you guys get the difference between hunting and gardening? Hunting, you're just going out there, you're finding this thing and you're shooting it, right? Gardening, what do you got to do? Well, first I got to prepare the soil, and then I've got to plant the seeds, and then I've got to water it, and I've got to tend to it. And that's exactly how sales are. And so you have to go out there and you have to spend time building trust with customers. You have to demonstrate the superiority of your product. There's all sorts of things you'd have to do before you ever make your first sale. And so if I'm telling you, hey, we need to immediately increase our inventory turns, increasing sales is not the answer. Increasing sales is not the answer. So we need to think about reducing inventory. Now let's talk about how we're going to reduce inventory. So picture this as being a big tank full of water, and there's a pipe up here, and there's stuff coming in, and there's stuff going out. Think of it as water. And then we have the water level in the tank. This water level represents our inventory level. How does stuff get out of our inventory?
Sell it.
Yeah. How does stuff get into our inventory?
Purchase.
Okay, so that's one way. What's the other way? Yeah, so purchase or produce, right? So we used to talk about the make or buy decision. Okay, now, if I want the water level to go down in the tank, what has to be the relationship between this and this?
Sales is bigger.
Yeah, the water coming out has to be bigger than the water going in. And so, of course, we could put this all apples to apples and call this COGS. But that's the idea. Now, between those things, what should I work on? What did we say about this thing here? Is this gardening or hunting?
Gardening.
It's gardening, so that's not the answer. So the answer has to be up here. And so what we do is we look through our inventory and we see where the excess stuff is. If you're lucky, it will be in the stuff that you've purchased. Because then all you have to do to bring down your inventory is to stop issuing purchase orders until you have consumed that inventory down. So I do the subscribe and save stuff on Amazon. And it's not perfect because my consumption of these products are a little bit smaller than the delivery quantities and period. And so every once in a while I have to skip a delivery or I wind up with extra something, right? And so that's the way you can think of this. If occasionally I'll wind up with extra, what do? I skip the next delivery. I stop issuing purchase orders. Now, why do I say that you're lucky if that's the case? Because the other situation is that you have to reduce production. Let's talk about what it takes to reduce production. Assume that your people are just working 40 hours a week, and now you have to reduce production. What does that mean? Yeah, so first of all, we know we're going to have to shut down our production operations. And that leaves you with two choices. And we don't call this firing, we call it laying off or right sizing or some bullshit term. But firing is in essence what it is. So our choices are either to lay these people off, or we can find something to keep them busy in the meantime. And a lot of people, including me, instinctively, the first time I encountered this, I was like, forget that. We're not going to pay these people to do crap, right? When we could lay them off and then just call them back in 3 weeks. And a manager explained it to me this way. He said, what do you think is going to happen when people leave here and they don't know for sure when they're going to come back? What are the good workers going to immediately go do? They're going to get another job. He said, what are the losers going to do?
Wait around to get rehired.
Yeah, they'll wait around, get rehired, and they'll suck up unemployment in the meantime. And who will we be left with? The cream of the crop. You're stuck with the losers when you do that. So, here's what we did. This was Duncan, Oklahoma, July 1994. The first thing we did is we shut the plant down and we spent a week cleaning and scrubbing. And even people, salaried folks like me, we were out there on the floor cleaning and scrubbing. And we had that place really, really clean. At the end of week 1, we took a snapshot of our inventory. And we're like, we're not quite there yet. So we decided to shut down for another week. During week 2, we painted. And we made the mistake of allowing the employees to choose the paint colors for their machines. And after we did that, have you guys ever been to the Gulf Coast of the U.S. and you see all those different colored houses next to each other? That's what our freaking shop floor looked like. It was creepy. Okay, at the end of week 2, the place is very well painted, and we took a snapshot of the inventory, and we were still too high. Week 3. By the way, in Oklahoma, land is cheap. And so we had probably over 100 acres of land there. And we usually were too busy to do anything as far as cleaning it up. But now we've got all these people. And what we did is went down to the local hardware store and we bought a bunch of those weed whackers that look like golf clubs. My dad calls them idiot sticks because even an idiot can make them work. Anyway, so we sent these people out into the July Oklahoma sun. Oh yeah. And thankfully they didn't force the salaried folks to go outside. By the way, the plant was air conditioned. And so these guys go out there and at the end of the week, the place looked great. And we snapshotted the inventory and we were good to go. And we said, Monday morning, report back to your regular shift indoors. I never saw a bunch of people happier to return to a factory than those poor bastards who had been out in the Oklahoma sun for a week. By the way, if you ever put people out in the sun like that, you've got to put out Gatorade and stuff or they'll freaking die on you. And then, OSHA, you don't want to do that. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. We can either reduce our purchases if that's the problem, or reduce our production, and this one is going to cost you one way or the other. Once again, why is this not the solution? Why is increasing sales not the solution?
Gardening.
Yeah, it's gardening, it's not hunting. It's going to take a while for that to take effect, but we can get more immediate results out of that. Okay, so that's reducing the inventory period. Now, let's talk about the accounts receivable period. So to get our AR turns up, we're talking about sales over accounts receivable. So now that you guys know how this fraction game is played, can you tell me which one of these I should be trying to move up and which one I should be trying to move down to increase this thing?
Increase sales.
Yeah, increase sales or?
Decrease accounts receivable.
Yeah, decrease accounts receivable. And once again, we know that increasing sales in the short term is not the answer. So we have to focus on accounts receivable. So how do you increase, or how do you decrease your accounts receivable? The answer is quite simple. You reach out to your customers who are not paying their bills. So I'll give you an example here. I met this guy at my folks' house. I don't know how they knew him, but he had formerly been a CFO for a Fortune 500 company. And he was there back when they were kind of getting started. And he said they were really cash poor at the time. And the raw material that they used was steel. And so he would be buying steel. He would receive the invoice from the steel manufacturer, and it would say 30 days or whatever. And he would type up the check, and he would stick it in an envelope, and he would type on the address of the envelope. He'd put a stamp on it, and what do you think he did with it?
Wait 20-something days.
Yeah, he'd wait actually more than that. Remember, they're giving him 30 days to pay. Ideally, what day would I tell you to drop this in the mail? Day 29, right? Something like that. Day 28, the mail's getting worse. Right? You drop it in the mail then. But that's not when he would drop it in the mail. He would not drop it in the mail until the person called and said, oh, hey, I think you might have missed this invoice. You need to go ahead and he would say, oh, yeah, don't worry about that. The check is in the mail. And what would he do? He would open his desk drawer, he would sort through and find the check. And then he would go and drop it in the mail. He said, I did that for 5 years, and only one vendor ever figured it out. He said, I had one vendor that would call me up on day 29 and say, don't forget to drop the check in the mail. And he'd say, no problem. And he'd pull that check out and drop it in the mail. Now, what does that mean? That means if you're on the other end of that and you're trying to reduce your receivables, you're going to be calling people, especially people that you know have a tendency not to pay their bills in a timely way. By the way, should you send them an email? No, what do they do?
Ignore.
Yeah, oh, that must have gone in my spam, right? You send them a text. I wouldn't do that. What do? Call them, or if you're fortunate enough to be local, you could just drop by. Hey, Fred, how you doing? How are the kids? Been fishing lately, by the way? Where's my check, right? I had a buddy whose father ran an independent oil distributor, and he sold to these little independent gas stations. And he would go around to collect. And they would give him sob stories about how their kids were, needed new shoes and crap like that, so they wouldn't pay their bills in a time. And he's a soft-hearted guy. He would give in and say, "Oh, don't worry about it." He would get home to his wife, and his wife would say, "So how did collections go today?" And he's like, "Oh, Bob's got this, Jim's got that," and all this kind of crap. The wife said, "You know what? Going forward, I will handle the collections." Things improved dramatically. She knew something that he didn't. She was running the household budget. They had 6 boys. What do you think their household budget? It had to be pretty big, right? And the money coming in from the collections would have been enough if people had just been paying their bills. But because they weren't paying their bills, she was motivated. And she went door to door collecting from these people. And you know what? They never had a problem with late pays again. So a lot of times it's choosing the correct person to send. Send the motivated person. Okay. So that's reducing receivables. What about increasing your payables period? How are we going to go about doing that? So we've got, which means reducing our payables terms. So we've got cost of goods sold divided by accounts payable. And we want to reduce this one. So the arrows are going to be in exactly the opposite direction. And we know that we don't want to reduce sales. That would reduce our profits, right? So what we really want to do is increase the amount of money that we owe other people. How do we do that?
Loans.
Okay, so basically when people sell stuff to us on credit, it is a 0 interest loan for the terms, right? So they're loaning us however much money, 0% interest for 30, 60, 90 days, whatever the terms are. If you get the invoice and you pay it immediately, are you taking full advantage of that? No. And so what you should do, and this is, so when I got my job at Halliburton, I was telling my cousin Ray about it. My cousin Ray's my dad's age. He had a trucking company. He says, I love Halliburton. I said, why do you love Halliburton? He said, because they pay off like a slot machine. I said, what do you mean? He says, I send him an invoice, 2 days later I have a check. Was Halliburton playing this game right? No. And it was really funny because I had a young lady sitting right here, and she said, we talked about that first guy. She said, well, I wish my company would handle accounts payable the way he was handling stuff. She said, we pay stuff immediately when we receive it. And so we agreed that was a bad deal. And here's the funny thing. I said, what's the name of your company? She told me the name of her company. It was the same company. It was the same company that the guy had the checks in his desk drawer. What do you think had changed? Remember, if you go back in time, the company was just getting started. They were low on cash. This guy was probably a part owner, and so he was motivated to make his accounts payable days as long as possible, right? But by the time we get to the 2010s or whatever, whenever I had this young lady, this company was a successful Fortune 500 company. Do you think the people that were taking care of accounts payable at that point were still really vested in the company? No. At that point, they're like, oh shit, someone sent me a bill, I better pay it, right? I just want to get it off my desk, which by the way is how I handle my bill so I don't forget to pay them, right? But when you do that with a corporation, you are not maximizing your accounts payable. So what should you be doing? You should be waiting till 2 days before the terms to drop the check in the mail. That way you're taking full advantage of that interest-free loan, and you are therefore expanding your accounts payable days, reducing the turns, and that's going to reduce the cash cycle. So let's talk about the potential negative impacts from each one of these things that we've just talked about. So we said to reduce the inventory period, we need to reduce the inventory on the shelf. And that all sounds great, except for one thing. Why do we have inventory on the shelf to begin with? If we could get by without inventory, would we do it? Oh, heck yeah. Inventory, we have to pay for it, we have to store it, it can go bad, right? We would avoid it if we could. Why do we keep it?
So you don't stock out.
Exactly, we're trying to avoid stockouts. A stockout is when your customer wants something and you don't have it. And so if you go overboard on this inventory reduction stuff, you can really mess yourself up. At Halliburton, when we had a stockout, we always knew about it because the customer had to call us and order. But what if you're someone like Walmart or Target? Do you know when there's a stockout? Someone walks into Walmart. I used to walk into Walmart, back when I walked into Walmart, I would walk into Walmart with a list of like 12 things that I wanted. And if they didn't have the first 3 things on the list, do you know what I did? Turn around and walk out. Did Walmart have any record of the fact that they lost sales that day? No. Now, with their current system of the app where you put stuff in and then you go to pick it up, they have a little better idea of what they're being stocked out on. They have a better idea of where they need to like put a little more inventory in place. Either way, if you don't have the inventory, you can miss out on sales, and when you miss out on sales, you miss out on profits. So that's the downside to trying to reduce your inventory period. Now, trying to reduce your receivables period, you run the risk of annoying your customers, right? When you call them and you're asking them to pay. I was talking to a local group here, and I was doing some pro bono consulting. Do you guys know what pro bono means? Free, right? Free consulting. And I go and I'm looking at their AR turns, because they have it on they have the chart on the wall, and they're doing a really good job of measuring these things, but they're not doing a very good job of analyzing, because their days in accounts receivable was doing this. And this was during the financial crisis. And it took me probably 15 seconds to look over their stuff. And it's all on the wall. And I turned around to them and I said, let me guess. You think of your customers as friends. And they said, yeah, how did you know? I said, because your friends are taking advantage of you. They are using you as an interest-free bank. And you are not reaching out to them to get payment, and so they assume you're okay. Have you ever heard the expression, the squeaky wheel gets the grease? Yeah, if you've only got enough grease for one wheel on your wagon, and you've got one wheel that's squeaking, that's the wheel you're going to put the grease on. That's why I'm telling you to call these people up. Now, the downside is that they may say, you know what, I don't need to do business with you anymore. And that's one of the things that they brought up. I said, you need to call these folks. And they're like, well, what if they stop buying stuff from us? And I said, you know what, I've got all the friends I need. What I need are paying customers. Customers that don't pay are not your friends. And I thought it was funny, I was giving this talk to a bunch of people for whom I was doing pro bono consulting. Right? Because they're not paying customers. It's a shocking idea, and you have to be willing to lose some customers. But the customers you lose are not paying customers, so you probably shouldn't care anyway. Does that make sense? Okay, and then the final thing with the increasing the payables period, as long as you do it within the terms, there's no downside. What if you start doing the Walmart idea, where you're increasing, they're giving you 30 days to pay, you're paying in 60 days, and you're not paying any late fees or penalties or interest? What might your suppliers start to do to you?
Bump up their rates.
Say again?
Bump up their rates.
Okay, so they could bump up so you'd have to be the price, right? Because I'm not paying whatever interest rate they're talking about. Well, what's the extreme thing they could do?
Cut them off.
Cut them off. Now, why was Walmart confident that the suppliers wouldn't cut them off?
Too much leverage.
Yeah, they're too huge, right? The market power. Most of you are not going to end up at an organization that has that kind of market power. So you have to tread the line. And that's why I'm telling you, just do it 2 days before the terms to maximize your AP within the terms that your suppliers have provided you, because most likely you're not going to have the market power. If you go to Walmart and that's the way they're doing business, I suppose that's what your boss tells you to do. I suppose that's what to do. Would you think that's ethical? Is it ethical to go beyond payment terms and then not pay the interest and penalties? No. Why was Walmart able to do it? Because of the market power. Questions? Okay. That's it on the operating and cash cycle. Now we're on to the cash budget and short-term borrowing. So the whole idea of the cash budget and short-term borrowing is to make sure that we do not run out of cash. And we're trying to look ahead and forecast what our cash sources and uses are going to be in every given period. We're going to be using quarters, but you could easily do this on a monthly basis. And we're going to figure out when we have the probability of running a negative cash balance. We're going to plan in advance and borrow money to cover that. And that's where the short-term borrowing comes in. So the cash budget is figuring out where we're going to be short. Short-term borrowing is how we're going to pave over those dips where we fall below zero on our cash level. And by the way, should we just be trying to hit zero on our cash level? No. Just like with your checkbook, do you ever take it down to exactly zero? No. You always want to have some sort of cushion in there. And it's going to be the same way with our cash at the company. Why is this so important? Because it's not a lack of profits that causes companies to go bankrupt. It's a lack of cash. You can have a well-functioning, profitable company, and if you don't handle this cash budget and short-term borrowing appropriately, you end up with a negative cash balance, which means you can't pay your bills, which means that you get forced into bankruptcy. So we don't want to do that. So our forecast of our cash budget, or our foundation of our cash budget, is the sales forecast. You guys remember when we talked about capital budgeting and what we said about marketing and sales types? Are they optimists or pessimists? They're optimists. And so if I were to guess, I would tell you that our true sales are likely going to be less than what is shown here. And so as a finance person trying to come up with the cash budget, one of the things that you should think about is what kind of a safety margin do I need to keep this place from going under if the sales forecast is off. And I hope you guys remember I told you about my marketing guy, Bob, that he was always 25% too high. So all I had to do was reduce his stuff by 20% and I had the correct answer or something really close. So if I knew that about my salespeople and their forecasts, then I could go ahead and make that correction before I start actually doing the cash budgeting. Now, these are predictions, and we just talked about the optimism, but there's also a random component to this. Do you think that some people's sales forecasts have been thrown into the trash as a result of the tariff and trade war stuff? Absolutely. And so things can fly out of the universe and mess you up, and you could be doing a wonderful job with your cash budget, and things can come along and just really mess you up. So that's something else to keep in mind. So we're told the firm starts the year with accounts receivable of 120, and they have a 45-day collection period. We're going to look at this one quarter at a time. How many days roughly are in a quarter? Yeah, roughly 90 days in a quarter. So that entire 120 should be collected within the first 45 days. So we're going to assume that during the next quarter that we're going to collect all of that outstanding cash that's out there, or the accounts receivable. We're also going to assume that we're going to collect half of the sales from the current quarter. Why? Because assume the sales are made uniformly over that 90-day period, the first 45 days worth of sales should have been collected before the end of the quarter. Have I lost anybody yet? Okay, now what happens to the last 45 days of the quarter? What's that going to end up being? That's the accounts receivable to start the next quarter. And when do we assume that money gets collected? The first 45 days of the next quarter. So do you see how this game is played? Okay. So here we have our sales forecast in millions, and we have our beginning receivables, which they told us was 120. So we've got, for quarter one, we've got the 120 beginning receivables. We've got sales of 200. Now we said that the quarter is 90 days. We're getting 45 days worth of that. How much of those sales do I expect to collect during quarter one? Of that 200, how much do I expect to collect?
100.
Yeah, 100, which is exactly one half, right? And so I'm going to be collecting 100 of the sales. I'm going to be collecting 120 of the outstanding receivables. So my total cash collected for the quarter should be 220. So So I've got my receivables plus my sales minus my cash collections gives me my ending receivables. Now you can check your work here. Your ending receivables should be exactly 1/2 of the sales from that prior quarter. And it is. 1/2 of 200 is 100. And so that goes up to become the beginning receivables of the next quarter. And in the next quarter, we have predicted sales of 300. How much of that 300 am I planning to collect during quarter 2? How much? Yeah, 150, exactly half of that 300 in sales. And so I've got the 100 plus the 150 gives me cash collections of 250. And so I've got 100 beginning receivables plus the sales of 300 minus the 250 gives me my ending receivables. And once again, your ending receivables, we can check that. It should be exactly 1/2 the sales, and it is. That becomes our beginning receivables for quarter 3. And in quarter 3, we plan to have 250 in sales. How much of that do I expect to collect during the quarter? Yeah, 125. So 125 plus 150 is 275. That's my cash collections. Well, I subtract that out, I get 125 in ending receivables, and that's just 1/2 of the sales as it should be. Now that becomes the beginning receivables for quarter 4. And in quarter 4, we expect to sell 400. How much of that do I expect to collect? 200. 200 plus that 125 that I had at the beginning, I add that together, it gives me 325. 125 plus 400 is 525 minus 325 leaves me with 200. 200 is exactly 1/2 of the sales. We can check our work. Sure enough, it comes out just right. Okay, so now we have that all squared away. That is our cash collections. Now we have to look at the cash outflows. So where are our cash outflows happening? First of all, payments of our accounts payable. And we've got our wages, taxes, and other expenses, plus capital expenditures. Do not let accountants fool you. The cash on a capital expenditure happens at the time that you make that expenditure. Depreciation isn't a real thing. That cash goes out when we buy the machine. And then we've got our long-term financing expense, which is interest and dividends. So let's take a look at this. They say that we assume that our payment of accounts is going to be equal to 60% of our sales. In other words, our accounts, our cost of goods sold is 60% of our sales price. Does that make sense? Okay, so we take 60% of 200 gives us 120, 60% of 300 gives us 180, 60% of, 250 gives us 150, and 60% of 400 gives us 240. Then I've got wages, taxes, and other expenses. Now they don't mention here, but it's also apparently a percentage of sales. Take a look at that. Each one of those are 1/3 of the amount above them, and the amount above them is 60% of sales, so we can say that the wages, taxes, and other expenses is just 20% of sales. And it makes sense that the labor is going to go along with the materials, which is that accounts payable stuff. And then we have this line called capital expenditures. Do you have capital expenditures in every quarter? No. In fact, you may go an entire year without doing a capital expenditure. But in this case, we have a capital expenditure of 100 in quarter 2. And then we have our long-term financing expenses, which is interest and dividends. Why does it make sense that interest would be the same every quarter?
Long-term debt.
Yeah, it's long-term debt, right? And so it's got a fixed payment pattern. We know we're going to be paying, let's assume that the interest payments are monthly. We're going to be paying the same amount every month. Multiply that by 3, it gives you your interest. Now, the one that's not quite as solid here is dividends. because you could, in theory, cut your dividend, right? Or you could increase it. But what happens most of the time? Yeah, it remains unchanged because we say dividends are sticky, right? So for at least the next year, we'll just make the assumption that our dividends are going to stay the same. And so when we add all those things up, by the way, those are all cash outflows. When we add all those up, we get our total cash disbursements of 180, 360, 220, and 340. And so now we're going to have to take that information and put it together with our cash inflows, our cash collections, and we get a picture of where we're going to have cash surpluses and where we're going to have cash deficits. So here we are in quarter one. We've got 220 coming in, and we've got 180 going out. Our net cash flow, therefore, is 220 minus 180, or positive 40. Do we need to be concerned? No, we've got, our cash is actually going up, right? So we don't need to be concerned that we're going to need to go out and borrow in the first quarter for that quarter. But what happens in the second quarter? Well, our total cash collections are 250, but our total cash disbursements are 360. Remember, that's where we had the extra 100 in capital expenditures. At that point, our cash flow is negative 110. Does that raise any alarms with you? It should. Now we're going to talk about one thing we haven't mentioned yet, and that is how much cash we had to start with. So whether or not you run around with your hair on fire probably has a lot to do with how much cash you started with. Then in quarter three, we've got a positive 55. That's not going to cause us any problems. But in quarter four, we once again have a negative cash flow of 15. So let's start out and assume that we have cash of 100. How much cash do I have in my cash account after quarter one? 140. After quarter two, how much cash do I have in the cash account? 30. And then quarter three, how much cash do I have after that quarter? 85. And then after quarter four, how much would I have? 70, right? What though if I started with cash of 50? After the first quarter, I've got 90. And then quarter two, I would have negative 20. That would be a signal to me that I need to engage in some short-term borrowing to cover that. Would I just borrow the 20, the negative 20? I would borrow more than that, right? Because you want to have a cushion. How much cushion is necessary? It depends on the volatility of your cash inflows. So think about city utilities here in Springfield. They probably have a pretty darn good idea from month to month how much money they're going to be getting. Do you think people tend to pay their utility bills? Yeah. Now compare that to Walt Disney World. Is Disney a required expense? No. If times are tough, what do people do? Yeah, they're like, screw the mouse. I'm not paying $20 for a hot dog and $1,000 to get into the park, right? And so their cash flows would be more volatile. If your cash flows are more volatile, that means that your safety padding there needs to be thicker. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's talk about that large cash flow in the second quarter. We said that it was a capital expenditure, but we've been looking at this from a short-term perspective. Should we be financing a capital expenditure with short-term borrowing? Typically what we say is you're going to borrow money in a term that matches the thing you're investing in. If I'm going to go out and buy a machine that's going to last 5 years, maybe I finance it for 5 years, and it's no longer a problem for my short-term cash flows. Does that make sense? So I go out, when we first got to town here, we bought a house. We paid $355,000 for it. Do you think I'm like, whoa, we got to have that in our checking account. I should go out and borrow that on the short term. The problem, by the way, do you think sometimes companies think that way? Let's take a look at it's actually kind of the same picture here. You guys know about the yield curve? This is time and this is percent for interest rates. Borrowing on the short term, your interest rates are typically lower. Borrowing on the long term, they're typically higher. So what do simple-minded people say?
Borrow short.
Yeah, borrow on the short term, and then a year from now, what do?
Borrow again.
Borrow again, right? And we'll keep our interest rate low as a result. What could be the problem with doing that?
Rates go up.
Okay, your rates could go up, that's true. What else?
We don't make the money to pay for
Yeah, so you could actually be profitable and have the money to pay the loan off, but what if you have something like we did during the financial crisis, where everybody was just too scared to lend? And here you are, you're a profitable company, but you've got all this debt due coming at the end of the year, and even though you've got your crap together, no one's going to lend you money. Credit markets have frozen up. There have actually been companies go bankrupt as a result of this situation. So I'll give you an example. Have any of you been to Las Vegas?
it. Yeah.
You have? Okay. Do you know where New York is?
No.
Do you know where MGM Grand is?
Yeah.
Okay. New York's right across the street from MGM Grand, the Strip. And then you go a little further down the Strip and you get to Aria and the Mandarin Oriental and some other places like that. It was a fancy development that was being built during the time frame right before the financial crisis. By the way, right before the financial crisis, interest rates, they were having to jack interest rates up to try to keep the economy under control. And so these people that were building all of that, they're like, well, hey, we'll just finance all this on the short term, and then we'll just keep issuing new short-term debt or borrowing new short-term money to pay off the old. And it's going to save us millions because the rates are lower. And that all worked really, really well right up until the financial crisis hit, and no one wants to loan money to anybody. At that point, even though they had what was ostensibly a decent project, no one's going to loan them money. And so the whole thing basically was about to go belly up when they finally got one of those Middle Eastern wealth funds like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or something like that, or the Emirates, to invest. Now, here's the interesting thing. Do you think that the Emirates loaned them the money? These people are, at this point things are too volatile, they won't be able to make the coupon payments. So instead of loaning them the money, they took an equity interest. And so now, instead of getting 100% of the residual cash flows, the initial investors are only going to get 50% of the residual cash flows. And so the profitability to the original investors was much lower. Why? Because they got greedy. Instead of borrowing on the long term and paying a little extra interest, they were trying to game the system down here on the short end, and as a result, they got called out. Why would borrowing on the long term have been okay for them? Do you think they would have been okay 5 years after the financial crisis? Probably so. But they weren't okay right then because everything got frozen up. And so that's the danger of trying to play this game of financing long-term assets with short-term money. You can really end up burning yourself. So what I'm telling you is when we go out to borrow that money in quarter two, should we be borrowing in the short-term markets? Probably not. We should be issuing bonds. We should be borrowing on a 5-year time frame from a bank, something like that. Does that make sense? So what kinds of short-term borrowing? We talked about the long-term capital investment, but if we have short-term deficits, short-term cash deficits, we can do short-term borrowing. And we'll basically talk about two big families of short-term borrowing. There's unsecured and secured. What is secured borrowing? Say again?
There's a leverage there.
There's going to be leverage either way.
Collateral.
Collateral. Yeah, there's collateral. So when I borrow money to buy a car, if it's a secured loan, what's the security? Yeah, the car itself. If I don't make the payments, they're going to come get the car. Now, contrast that with a loan that was made for the same amount of money, and I go out and buy the car with it, but the note is not secured by the car. That would be unsecured borrowing. Which of those do you think is going to have a higher interest rate?
Unsecured.
Yeah, the unsecured has to, because it's riskier. If you fail to pay on your secured debt, I can go out and take your motorcycle, your house, your boat, whatever. If it's unsecured, then I basically just have to come after you and your assets in general, and I may not get anything. And so the unsecured borrowing has to have higher costs. So let's talk about unsecured short-term borrowing. The first thing we're going to talk about is the line of credit. Now, with a line of credit, we're saying we're going to loan you up to a certain amount. And you don't borrow that money right away. In fact, you may not tap that money at all. The line of credit at a company usually is kind of a backup thing for the company to have if they find themselves suddenly in short of cash, right? They can tap that line of credit. In fact, this was kind of interesting. During the financial crisis, it was at the end of George Bush II and at the beginning of Barack Obama. And Obama is trying to, at the State of the Union, he's trying to tell us it's all going to be fine. And he keeps talking about green shoots, meaning that things are growing back. And one of the pieces of evidence that he gave was the increased bank loans. Well, this is perfect evidence that things are turning around. He was so wrong. What was going on was companies were in bad shape, so they were tapping their lines of credit. And of course, on the bank's balance sheet, that shows up as a new loan because it's new money they've lent out, but it was not a sign of good health. It was a sign of bad health. Okay, so they're typically evaluated on an annual basis. What does that mean? It means I'm going to tell you that you can have this line of credit until 1 year, and then we're going to determine whether or not we're going to make that offer to you again. But what we're going to do is we're going to say you're going to have a month in between where you've got everything paid off. We call that the cleanup period. And here's why we do the cleanup period. Remember how I told you the scumbags will try to finance long-term assets with short-term money? If we don't have that cleanup period, we may be having people financing their long-term assets with their short-term line of credit. If they came to you for a longer-term loan, you would be charging them more interest. So that's why we're going to force them to do this cleanup period once per year. Now, it can be committed or uncommitted. So a committed line of credit is regardless of how bad you suck. At the time that you need the money, I am committed to loaning you that money, and I will loan you that money, even though at the time it may not seem like the best decision. An uncommitted line of credit, when you come to me, and you come to me 2 weeks after everything has just gone to hell, I can, as a bank, say, you know what, we're not gonna loan you that money. It wasn't a committed line of credit. We don't have to do that.
Is the committed fee typically based on risk profile?
Exactly. So, and the point he's getting to here is, let's ask first of all, what would you rather have as a borrower, committed or uncommitted? As a borrower? Yeah, as a lender, you'd rather have uncommitted. As a borrower, you would rather have committed. And so you might say, hey, wait a minute, what's it going to take to get you guys to have a committed line of credit versus uncommitted? And the answer is the commitment fee. If your business is very stable and your cash flows are very even, your commitment fee will be lower than for a firm that has volatile cash flows. Does that make sense? It's all based on risk. Okay, now, a revolving credit arrangement is like a line of credit, but it's open for 2 or more years. In fact, many of you are probably involved in revolving credit arrangements right now. What example do you probably have in your wallet of a revolving credit arrangement? Yeah, credit card. And keep in mind with revolving credit and with lines of credit, I can borrow and pay this thing down. You know, it's not a set thing, right? So I can borrow the money in May, and then I end up paying it down in September. I borrow a little more in October. I pay it more down in December. And so that's the way also the revolving credit arrangement works. However, the outstanding balance, you're going to be paying the interest on it, just like you do on the credit card. Okay, now something that banks may require of borrowers is something called the compensating balance. The compensating balance, so I'll give you an example here. We'll loan you $10,000, but you'll have to put $1,000 on deposit with us at no interest. And the reason that you're going to do that, that's to compensate us for the cost of doing business here. So that's an additional cost that goes along with this. And so if I ask to borrow $10,000 and they're only going to allow me to actually take $9,000 with me, I'm going to be paying interest on the full $10,000, but I'm only going to be getting $9,000. And so the interest rate with a compensating balance is actually going to be higher than the stated interest rate. And on the next slide, I'll teach you how to figure out what that actual interest rate is. And then finally, we have the letter of credit. It's a promise of a bank to make a loan if certain conditions are met. Now, usually the line of credit, the letter of credit, you'll see that used a lot in foreign trade. And so if I'm going to be importing some coffee beans from Colombia, I can actually get a letter of credit from my bank. And then when the coffee bean supplier shows up at the port in Colombia with the beans, I'm going to have a third-party inspector there, and he's going to make sure that the beans are the weight that they said and the grade that they said, and that they're not moldy and whatnot. And as soon as he does, then the coffee exporter can take that document, the letter of credit, down to the local bank. And the local bank will offer to purchase that from him, the debt, for, say, 90% of the value. And so he gets to walk away with the cash, and then they turn around, and now they have what's called a banker's acceptance. And that is what they use to turn around and collect the money from the original bank that wrote the letter of credit. So the reason I'm telling you all that is that's where we typically see letters of credit is involved in this foreign trade thing. Now, letters of credit can be revocable or irrevocable. Does this sound familiar? It sounds a hell of a lot like committed or uncommitted. If you're doing business and you're trying to get a letter of credit, do you want it to be revocable or irrevocable? Yeah, you want it to be irrevocable because you don't want the bank to be able to, whoop, at the last minute say, oh, no, we're not going to cover that. Now, what do you assume that means? Are you going to have to pay a little more to get an irrevocable letter of credit? Yeah. And once again, is the fee going to be paid based on the risk? Of course it will be. Questions so far? By the way, these are all unsecured, so we're looking at higher required returns. Let's talk about the cost of a compensating balance. So we've got this example here. The quoted interest rate on the credit line is 16%, and the lender requires a 10% compensating balance. So we need $54,000. Always start with the amount that you need. Because of this compensating balance thing, can we just borrow $54,000? No, because they would keep $5,400 and we would be left with less money than we needed. And so what do we have to do? The first thing we have to do is figure out how much we actually have to borrow. And so we're going to take that $54,000 and we're going to divide by 1 minus the size of that compensating balance, which is 10% here. And so that's going to be 0.9. We're only going to get 90% of the money. And so we're going to have to take 54,000 divided by 0.9. And when I do that, I see that I have to borrow $60,000. What is 10% of $60,000?
6K.
Yeah, 6,000 bucks. And what's left over then? 54. So we know we did our math right. Okay, now they're telling me that I'm paying 16% for 60,000 bucks, but I'm actually only getting 54,000. And so the first thing that I've got to do is figure out how much interest am I actually paying on this loan. And it's going to be 16% times the 60,000 that I borrow. So that's $9,600 per year. But I did not get 60,000. I only got 54,000. So now I'm going to take that 9,600, divide by 54,000, and see that in reality, my true interest rate is 17.78% once I take the compensating balance into account. Does that make sense?
What's the benefit to the lender of doing this instead of just giving them a $54,000 loan at 17.78?
You know, that's a good question. They are identical from a cash flow perspective. From a perspective of trying to sell these things, especially to naive people.
So that's, okay.
Yeah. And the other thing is this. Is it possible that these people don't actually need, that they think they might not need money? You know, so that they're gonna borrow a certain amount, but they're gonna leave a certain amount. You know, so but you're absolutely right. There is no cash flow difference between those two options.
It's kind of just hoping people aren't going to calculate their true rate.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, then do you think that happens all the time? So your credit card probably says 18% APR or something like that. What's your effective annual rate?
Higher.
Yeah, it's higher. But do you think they kind of count on you not being able to figure that out? Yeah. That's my guess. I've never done this kind of banking myself, so I couldn't tell you. I can tell you this. A lot of the things that we see are the way they are because that's the way it's always been done. And so you'll see some weird stuff and you say, why the hell is that? And the answer is, well, that's how we've always done it. Like, for instance, when you price a zero coupon bond, we price it as if it's semi-annual. Like it's paying 2 zero coupons per year. Why? Well, it turns out that that's the way all the other bonds are priced, and bond traders just aren't that clever. So that's how we price zero coupon bonds. Isn't that sick? It doesn't make any sense, but that's what we do. Okay, next time we will start talking about secured short-term borrowing. I want you guys to go ahead and read the inventory stuff and be ready to talk about that next time.